Good afternoon, everyone. Molly Grover with the Dubuque Area Chamber of Commerce, and on behalf of myself and our colleagues at the Dubuque Regional Airport, thank you so much for joining us today for this very special report on air service locally and the impact of COVID. We are so fortunate to be joined by our air service consultant today, Mr. Jeffrey Hartz. He has worked with the Dubuque community on air service with us for a very long time. He was instrumental in us getting a fourth flight. We continue to work with him this day and enhancing our air service priorities here in the community. And he's really an expert. Former employee with American Airlines and a longtime consultant with Mead and Hunt. And so we've asked him to prepare this presentation for us today to give us kind of a lay of the land on what's going on in air service, especially as it applies to the Dubuque Regional Airport and our market. I would ask everyone, if you have questions, to please put those in the chat feature. When Jeff is done with his presentation, we will open it up to questions. But if you have questions along the way, go ahead and put those in the chat feature so that we can get to those right away after Jeff's presentation. With that, again, on behalf of our colleagues at the Dubuque Regional Airport, the airport manager, Todd Dalsing, you can see is with us today as well. Thank you for joining us for this special presentation. With that, I turn the presentation over to our special guest speaker and our friend, Mr. Jeffrey Hartz. Jeff.
I appreciate it, Molly. And although I appreciate the kind words on the long-time employee, I feel old when I hear that. So I appreciate it, though. Obviously, things have changed quite a bit in the industry. I have been fortunate to work with Dubuque for many years, as far as directly with the airlines, as well as now working with Mead and Hunt. And we're definitely in a period of time that it's never been seen before in the industry, and wanted to kind of give an update on what's going on in the industry, overall, what's going on specifically with each of the individual airlines. Then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on with Dubuque. Obviously, lots has changed. Not definitely for the better, but we do feel that there is, some light at the end of the tunnel and some opportunities moving forward, and then talk about kind of the air service options, because again, right now it is definitely a challenge, and we'll talk through that. So overall industry trends, it's been kind of one of these cycles. The airline industry, kind of the old adage, certainly when I came into it, was how do you make $1 million in the airlines? You start with $1 billion. Turns out how you make $1 in the airlines is you now start with $1 billion. And so the airlines are going to be pretty close to wiping out all the money they made over the last 10 years in the next 2 or 3 years. This year has at this point been almost a $30 billion loss, and that's in 6 months. And it is going to likely last for quite a while going forward. Even as things recover, it's just going to take time to get the industry healthy again. So when you look at the last 30 years, 40 years here, the one thing the airlines have always been cyclical. You always run into recessions. Every time the recession happens, back in the early 80s and the early 90s, again, 9/11 and then the Great Recession, we always saw a dip in the airline industry. And it typically took 2 or 3 years to recover. In the case of 2009, you ended up having almost a 6-year recovery following the Great Recession to get the overall industry back. And the one thing we'll talk about a little bit later is not everything is equal. So when you see it, the overall industry, meaning, all 400 commercial service airports got back to normal. There's a lot of airports that grew, within that first year or two following the downturns, and several airports that never even declined through that period. What's different now in COVID-19 is every single market is down, and a lot of them are down, 60, 70%. It's really hit harder the business market, whereas we saw, post 9/11 and post Great Recession, there was reduction in business traffic, but it's still honestly buoyed most of the industry. Right now, when you look at it, is the industry has no business traffic. It is essentially wiped away, and that has really driven the preponderance of the problem that's occurring right now. So when you look at it, and there's going to be some probably fairly negative charts and graphs in this. I apologize, but we're just trying to, again, just show really what's going on to set the stage. why it's not just happening in Dubuque. It's really everywhere in what the issues are going on with the airline. So when you look back at this year, so far, January, hey, we started off great. The industry overall was 6% year over year up in passengers. February was up 2% year over year. And then COVID hit in the United States. It bottomed out at 95% reduction in passengers in April. We are, and the amazing thing to kind of think about it, when you look at the passenger numbers, we've gone up, fourfold in passengers in the United States since April, but we're still down 65% year over year. And that really kind of puts in perspective that while there's been some nice trends and nice improvements, we are a very long ways away from where we need to be. When you look at it by region, and again, I apologize, again, this is a complicated spaghetti graph. There's a lot of things going on here. I think the key is all of the regions. This is broken down by the FAA regions. The Northeast, the East, Northwest is, Washington, from Central Colorado up to Washington State. The West is Arizona and California and Nevada. But what we see in this is everybody declined together. Essentially, everybody went from where they were right down immediately down to 95% in, April and early May. But then at that point, we started getting a divergence. And what happened is the regions and airports that really, really relied upon business traffic never came back to the same direction. So you look at the Northeast, you look at the East especially, those markets have not recovered anywhere near like what we see in the Southeast, thanks to Florida, the West in some degree, thanks to Arizona, but especially the Northwest region. That's the Intermountain area, essentially Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. Those markets have done very, very well this year comparatively. There were actually some markets that were down, only 10 or 15% through the summer period, in large part because the leisure market shifted. If again, you're business oriented, it just hasn't come back. Leisure oriented really has changed and shifted for that. One more look at the TSA ones. Again, this kind of removes the ups and downs and does the 7-day average for it. And what you can really see here, again, we had a big, strong climb up right and through, July period. And while we've had a little bit of a bump in September and October, the reality is we're relatively plateaued. We've essentially found, as an industry, where the leisure markets is without much business traffic, and with certain regions not doing a whole lot of leisure travel as well. And so at the end of the day, this is likely what we're going to expect for the foreseeable future, just because of the fact that we're not seeing that business traffic respond. And there's only so much leisure traffic that is out there available. So you look at it by an airline basis. We've got two different looks here. The first slide looks at the legacy carriers. Those are American, Delta, United, and Southwest. They represent 80% or so of the country's capacity. And as you can see, again, started off January, February, everyone was up essentially year over year. Even in March, most of them were essentially flat. And then the floor came out. April, they tried to get capacity out. The problem is the airlines, because of the way everything's built, can't just pull service for something tomorrow. Unlike a regular store that could, in theory, shut down operations tomorrow and close up, it's really hard to do that for an airline because of the sunk cost, essentially, once you enter a month by the employees and the aircraft and everything else. It's hard to get that out. You're only really saving at the end of the day fuel expense. So it took them about a month and a half to get that out. By May is where you got to the bottom of the capacity there for all the airlines. But then we look forward into October, November, December, and you can see the airlines at varying levels of what they want to do. American and Southwest had the highest number of passengers through the summer, the number of seats through the summer, while Delta and United were a little bit more conservative. What we're getting to now in the fall is a little bit of a divergence here, especially when it comes to American versus Delta. Delta has kept a little bit bigger market there than American compared to what it was last year. Delta's almost 70% of last year. American's only 57% of last year. Part of that is, and we'll talk about in a second, is the relative financial performance. American is definitely doing worse than their brethren right now in the rest of the industry. Secondary airlines, this is kind of really a tale of two worlds here. The secondaries are made up of some regionalized airlines like Alaska and JetBlue, which are a little more traditional. They're much more like American, United, and Delta than they are to Allegiant or Spirit or Frontier. So those airlines have been hit about as hard as American and Delta and United and Southwest have. But what you see with that light green and the red with Spirit and Spirit and Allegiant is a much less reduction across the board in passengers. And that's because they didn't have business traffic to begin with. Allegiant and Spirit really never had business traffic. They'd get some incidental ones, but their model was predicated on 95% of their traffic being leisure oriented. So this hasn't hit them nearly as hard. So they've been able to keep a little bit more of that capacity in there, but still down, 20% or more across the board. So when you look at it, we looked at it by the different airlines, it's also not exactly the same for each individual airport. This is actually a little misleading in some regards when you look at from December 2020 versus December 2019 by hub. And so the FAA defines hubs essentially on the percentage of amount of passengers they carry versus the national average. Non-hub airports are like Dubuque. Small hub airports are the ones that are a little bit bigger. Those are ones like a Des Moines, Iowa. And then you get into the medium hubs, which is like an Omaha, like a St. Louis. And the large hubs are the big guys. Those are the Chicagos and the Dallases and the Denvers, et cetera. And so overall, you look at the total, we're down about 40% December from where we were last year. But medium hubs are down the most. And again, large part, that's because a lot of the medium hubs tend to be a little bit more business oriented as far as the traffic makeup than you compare them to the larger hubs. The small hubs and the non-hubs are a little bit misrepresented in this in some regard because Allegiant actually has a huge proportion of their flying actually in smaller hubs, especially in certain regions. Regions like, the mid-plains, the Intermountain West, where Allegiant does have actually a fairly large percentage of the seats in a given market. So that's helping buoy that up a little bit more than it otherwise would be. And here again, looking at it on one other look, top 50 U.S. airports, looking at domestic seat change here, you can see here all airports essentially, except for 4, had a greater than 25% reduction. They're only at 75% or less of where they were last year. The only exceptions to that are Denver and Salt Lake, which are those Intermountain West hubs. Again, as I talked about before, the Western region, especially essentially starting in the Dakotas, going to Idaho, that area did phenomenally well this summer because of essentially the leisure traffic wanting to get out to wide open places and wide open spaces. So Denver and Salt Lake City are kind of leading the way there for hubs, but then you have San Juan and then you have Fort Myers. Leisure markets, again, at the end of the day, people are wanting to go to leisure destinations. Even that next swath, the ones that are there at the 70%, a lot of those tend to be leisure-oriented destinations. But when you get to the bottom there, below that red line, but below the average, if you notice, almost all of those tend to be business markets, business hubs, the San Franciscos, the New York Cities, the San Jose's, the Raleigh-Durhams, New Orleans, Austin, markets that usually are either business-oriented or massive convention-oriented towns, since, again, that traffic essentially ceased to exist. As I mentioned before, this is one of the slides, again, this is a lot on here. Essentially, what this is showing is back going the last 20 years, as we've had declines after 9/11, as we've had declines after the Great Recession, the one constant that's happened essentially for the last 30 years has been the non-hubs, the smaller airports, recovering quicker. What's unique here is the smaller hubs in some regards have gotten hit harder. Sorry, the non-hubs. the smaller airports have been hit harder because they tend to be more oriented to business traffic. Dubuque's a great example of that. One of the things that we love touting when we're talking to American and United in the past is the fact that, 85, 90% of our makeup that flies out of Dubuque Airport is business traffic. That means, it's relatively stable. They have a higher fare than if it was leisure. It's a good thing for the airlines until COVID hit. And then it actually became a liability because the business traffic dried up and there's not the leisure traffic behind it to be able to help fill that void there. So what this essentially is, and what we believe is going to happen is for the next, 6 months to maybe a year, depending on how long it takes for the COVID situation to, stabilize, reduce, and be eliminated, the smaller markets, the markets that are business oriented, are going to continue being hit the hardest. But we expect those smaller markets, like in Dubuque, to recover quicker when that occurs, just like they have in the past. So looking at the individual airlines, American Airlines, obviously, most important one in the case of talking about Dubuque, because they were our only airline. So American had initial capacity cut about 75%, 92% internationally, 70% domestic. So again, they essentially shut down everything internationally. One of the things, at least initially for them, on why they had higher passenger numbers than some of the other airlines, they're not as big internationally as United and Delta. One of the other benefits that they had, by sort of sheer luck, you could call it, by placement, is that the South tended to recover quicker this summer than the northern part of the country. And so American's two biggest hubs in Dallas and Charlotte actually stayed a little bit bigger and they stayed a little bit stronger. They also had Miami and Phoenix being a little bit more leisure oriented that actually were able to stay a little bit stronger as well through this period. What that didn't, though, do is translate into improved profitability for American. American has had the biggest challenge financially for all the airlines. And right now, their biggest problem is they are burning cash quicker than any other airline out there. So American, in their latest earnings call, said that they're burning about $44 million a day in the third quarter. They hope that continues to be reduced through the winter time, but they haven't been able to get the costs out nearly as much. They weren't nearly as successful as Delta or Southwest, especially at getting voluntary furloughs or voluntary separations of the company of some of their more senior staff, as far as on the seniority for pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, which essentially meant when American had to reduce their flying, they reduced their employees at the bottom of the payroll. So their cheapest employees are the ones that end up being furloughed and let go, while the more expensive employees are still flying. And that has absolutely affected their profitability. Over 150 aircraft have been removed from the fleet. They've terminated 4 different types of aircraft that will not be flying ever again for them. And we expect that it's going to take a while for them to fully build back out into where they were in 2019. Delta, they were a fairly quick reduction. They cut deeper to the bone than American. They cut 80% domestically, 95% international. They have a little bit bigger international exposure than American as well. One of the things they also did is they also limited capacity on their flights. So when you look at their passenger numbers and their load factors, a lot of it is actually artificially deflated or lowered because of the fact that they're only offering about 2/3 of the seats on their airplane to sell, whereas American pretty quickly, frankly, in May, removed those caps and started selling every seat on those airplanes. So that absolutely has impacted Delta. They've retired 6 different fleet types here in the last 6 months, which has helped reduce costs. But they also were very aggressive with voluntary separations, trying to essentially buy out employees to have them either retire early or voluntarily separate from the company to get costs down. And so they've been able to get their burn rate down to about $18 million a day. Again, substantially less than American. United, closer to what Delta did than American has done. They've been fortunate in large part with Denver. Denver has not been hit nearly as hard. The rest of their hubs have been hit fairly hard, frankly, because of their location in the New York City, the Washington, D.C., the San Franciscos and LAs. Those areas in Chicago's got hit harder than some of the middle parts of the country did. And so they did get hit especially hard at the beginning outside of Denver, which really helped quite a bit. They've done a lot of point-to-point flying, more so than a lot of the other legacies, adding in new non-hub flights into Florida, especially, adding more markets into the Caribbean, into the beach destinations in Mexico. They're essentially finding, as I've been saying, I've had very much a trend here, the business traffic's not here. They're just trying to find warm bodies that are trying to be able to get to a leisure destination. At the end of the day, where people want to go are wide open places, which has really helped Denver tremendously, and then Florida and the Caribbean. And that's where they've been adding in that capacity. One thing that's important for them as a second note, all these airlines, again, we're trying to find voluntary furloughs, voluntary separations to avoid the furloughs, reductions in pay. They did do a deal with their pilots that reduced the minimum number of hours that each pilot has to get paid each month in order to essentially avoid furloughing pilots. Part of that, though, changed their scope clause. Scope clause is essentially language in contracts that limits what regional flying can be done for that airline. In this case, it actually reduced the amount of hours that the regional airline can fly on behalf of United to matching what United itself flies. And so this goes through at least June 2021. So it does limit some of the opportunities or growth that United could do on those regional aircraft. Southwest Airlines, they are doing, essentially starting off the pandemic, just like everybody else, they cut capacity. They couldn't cut quite as much of theirs, partly just because of the way that their system is structured. On not having true hub and spoke systems, they couldn't eliminate a lot of flying without eliminating, cities or regions or ability to get from point A to point B. So they only were able to cut down to about cut 60% down from where they were. Unlike the other airlines, were more like 80%. The Hawaii additions that they added this year, that just started back off here essentially in the last month or so, have really helped their capacity through this winter time on a year-over-year basis. But one of the things they're doing that's infamously Southwest is when the industry or other airlines are challenged, they really go for the jugular. They really take this as an opportunity to grow and to fight back. And Southwest has already added 11 new cities, or announced 11 new cities here over the last 4 months. We expect that number to grow and likely grow significantly over the next year, as all the other airlines are having much more financial problems than Southwest has. And so Southwest burning the lowest amount of cash every day. They've got some of the strongest balance sheet of all the airlines, which has led them to be able to be a little bit more aggressive to be able to get market share or get even gate space at airports they otherwise would never fly to. For example, they're starting to fly out of O'Hare at the end of this year, not just Midway. Same thing in Houston. They'll be flying out of Intercontinental, not just Hobby. So they are absolutely looking at places to be able to get market share from the other airlines. All the other airlines, again, this is Alaska, JetBlue, Spirit, Frontier, Allegiant, Hawaiian, Sun Country. I'm sure I'm missing a few other regional ones. This is absolutely a tale of two worlds. If you are a regional business airline, quote unquote, like an Alaska, like a JetBlue, you're essentially doing the same as your brethren that are legacy carriers. If you're Allegiant, if you're Frontier, if you're Spirit, you're absolutely doing better because you're laser focused on leisure traffic, and that's what's around right now. Hawaiian, they got hit hard in large part because of the quarantine restrictions going to Hawaii. That got lifted October 15th, so they're starting to be able to go a little bit more full bore into what they want to do. Still down a lot from their international pieces, and domestically, but they're able to add a lot more than what they were earlier this year. So again, if you're leisure oriented, you're doing not so bad. So at the end of the day, as an industry as a whole, before we switch over and talk about Dubuque specifically, I can't overstress that this is truly unprecedented. Obviously, as a nation as a whole, it has been something that everybody is grappling with. The industry, especially airlines, there's probably not another industry that's been hit harder than them, and will in some cases just take a very, very long time to recover. The business traffic, for all intents and purposes, has vanished. There is some, of the emergency things, the must-travel type stuff that's still there, but any and all discretionary business traffic is just physically gone, and it doesn't appear to be coming back until at least sometime in 2021 at the earliest. With that, average fares have really plummeted quite a bit. When you look at the legacy airlines, Delta, United, American, those airlines typically get, 40, 50, 60% of their revenue from about 10% of their customers. When you lose that 10% of their customers, that's a problem. And that has really driven those fares down tremendously. When you're not having those last minute business travelers buying tickets, it means you're essentially only selling the leisure fares. So the average fares are dropping, and even those leisure fares are actually dropping as the airlines are trying to stimulate demand, trying to get people to travel when they otherwise would. Fleet retirements have really changed quite a bit. Again, aircraft that everyone assumed would be around for a decade or more at various airlines are now parked and parked permanently, especially for airlines like American and Delta. The last bullet point, again, this is what we're talking about. Recovery to pre-COVID-19 levels, essentially back to 2019, is likely going to take at least till 2023. And if, frankly, wouldn't be surprising if it's not 2024 or 2025. That does not mean that's the case for something like Dubuque. We'll talk specifically about Dubuque here in a second, but like what we see is, and I've talked about before, as the COVID situation essentially works its way through and hopefully the business traffic starts coming back in the the mid-2021 timeframe, we expect the smaller markets to recover quickly, in large part just because they didn't fall as much per se as the bigger markets. For example, like a Dubuque going from 3 to 2, frankly not down to 0, but once we get service coming back in, we're back up to essentially 2 round trips, which means we're only 1 round trip off of our historical numbers. So once that recovers, we're back up to 3. I expect a market like Dubuque to be back to 2019 levels, really, in a relatively short order once the COVID situation recovers. I think when you see some of these big cities, big hub markets, those are going to take a much longer time, like we saw after the Great Recession, potentially taking 5 or 6, 7 years to fully recover. So looking at Dubuque specifically, and it is really a shame everything that's gone on the last 7, 8 months with COVID, because we have really done a great job with Bob before, with Todd now, working with Molly the whole time on being able to stabilize and grow our service over the last 9 years following the Great Recession and changes there. From 2012 to 2017, we had a very large growth in traffic. We grew 25% during that time frame. And that was in large part because of, the work that Molly's done, the commitment from the business community to use the service at Dubuque. And then we've had the challenges really this year, which has led to some significant reductions. And then obviously, as we know, elimination of service for the at least foreseeable future. And we'll talk about that more specifically here. So with that, leading into this one, back in mid-August, American had been kind of signaling to Congress and frankly to communities that there's a lot of untenable situation going on financially for them. They were the hardest hit, as we talked about. They have the weakest balance sheet by a very long ways of all the airlines. And it has put them in a little more precarious situation. And so they announced that in August that 15 markets would be eliminated from service temporarily unless the CARES Act funding that held the payroll support program was extended for the airlines. As we know, that was not extended, and it did end on October 1st, which led to these suspensions. So of those 15, American announced 2 markets couldn't be canceled or couldn't be suspended. They were part of the legacy Essential Air Service program. Frankly, they were quirks, we'll call it. The Essential Air Service program back in 2011, Congress decided to change the law and eliminate the ability for communities that were not receiving subsidized service prior to September 30th, 2011, to receive subsidized service ever again in the future. In the case of Joplin, Missouri and Sioux City, Iowa, both of them received subsidized service prior to that period. Both of them subsequently were removed from the subsidized program, but were retained inside of that, grandfathered into that subsidized program ability. But that is a point to bring up and make sure people understand, is that when Congress made this change, it was a little talked about part of the language, part of the appropriations bill, was the changing of the Essential Air Service program. If that hadn't have been changed, none of these 11 markets would have been at risk of losing service. They would have been able to rely upon the Essential Air Service program that was designed to avoid exactly this, that communities to retain their service in a obviously extraordinary times like we're in right now. So what American has done, and they alluded to prior to that August number, and they've alluded to it since then, is that there's a larger list with more markets. We've heard everything from there's 30 to there's more than 30. We don't know. American's obviously not told anybody about them. I think we could all speculate on which markets are in there, but at the end of the day, American is losing a lot of money each and every day, and the smaller markets, because they tend to be more business oriented, have been hit harder than many of them. So that is what they've decided to do. A bit on kind of the frustrating side, I think for a lot of people in the business community and the airport, frankly, has been the way Americans cancel the service. And hopefully I can explain why this is actually a good thing in their mechanism for why they're canceling in these blocks. So what American is doing, they're hoping that there's going to be a CARES Act extension, that payroll support program extension at some point coming out of Congress. And they've promised to Congress and to the communities that if they receive that federal funding, they would reinstitute service to all of these markets. They're also uncertain of when demand returns. It's hard to tell if demand's going to return, 6 weeks from now, 10 weeks from now, 26 weeks from now. And so without knowing that, typically when you cancel service or you're suspending service, you want to cancel it out, into the far future. If it's 6 months from now, 9 months from now, except if that happens, it becomes a lot more of a challenge for American to add that service back in to Dubuque and these other markets that were canceled because they're not physically there. They're not in the system selling tickets. They're not, the people that have already booked have been funded and made other travel plans. So what they're doing is canceling in these 4-week blocks. So this weekend, American will be removing the December block. They'll essentially wait another, 2, 3, 4 weeks, and then they'll make a decision on that January block, and they'll continue moving forward until, again, either the funding from local sources, federal funds is made to help offset some of their costs and help stem some of their losses in each of these markets, or until they see demand recovering. And we don't know if that's, again, February 1st, April 1st, June 1st. We really don't know that. And that's one of the reasons why Americans continuing to keep that service out into the future, even though they're canceling closer in, hoping they see signs of life in the traffic and that they can justify leaving that service in going forward. So regional capacity changes, kind of comparisons year over year. Again, this is a little bit, not really, it's a little bit muddy, as we'll call it, because there is an awful lot of Allegiant service in a lot of these. In Peoria, in Moline, in Cedar Rapids, those markets that are down the least are actually the ones that have Allegiant service, which has helped buoy that because they're flying bigger airplanes and they really haven't eliminated much of that flying. But you can see again, Dubuque on where we trended. We did trend towards the bottom of the pack with the markets there. And then American's decision in October to cancel service obviously let us down to 100% loss on that one. Load factor trends, again, when you look at kind of some of our peer markets in the region, we did start lower with a lower load factor through this winter than some of our peer markets. That is something that, again, that just is a natural thing that happens for our market. We do have a little bit lower load factor in the January and February timeframe. In large part, it's because of weather factors and natural change in demand with business traffic in January and February, especially with connections over Chicago. That's not something that I would say is abnormal. That is something to be expected because of the winter period and our service just to Chicago causing that. Through the rest of the year, again, we did essentially end up on the lower portion of that until June, when American did drop us down to a single round trip in the market, where we did get back up to the more close levels with our competition. Again, Sioux City is another one that was canceled as part of that, and they trended with a load factor actually lower than Dubuque through that time frame. So at the end of the day, what are options? And this is a slide that, frankly, we could probably talk about for the next hour and a half, but I'll try to go through this relatively quickly and we'll be able to answer some questions as well. So with our current American service, the number one thing that can be done is, frankly, pushing the federal delegation to support that CARES Act extension and the payroll support program. At the end of the day, that is the one guarantee that would bring American service back in. They've said that time and again, if they had that to help support them, to help mitigate that cash loss that they have every single day with their airline, that would enable them to start back service in those 11 markets. One of the things that American has said has been, if a community can come up with some local funds to help support their service locally. They're not looking for cash to be able to completely offset their losses. They understand that these are definitely trying times, but they have said that if there is some local funds available, that they would be open to having a conversation on reinstating service in any of these markets through that type of support. Frankly, the third option at the end of the day is we just wait. That's probably the hardest one to sit here and say from my perspective. I'm sure from y'all your perspectives, but it's just waiting this out, waiting for hopefully this Pfizer vaccine that's shown so much promise to come into play. But even when that happens, we're not talking December or January. It's likely February, March, April, May, probably closer to May or June than March or April to have that COVID situation across the board to help improve demand where American would reinstate service. Hoping I'm wrong on that. I'm hoping that'll be quicker, but I think on a realistic basis, that's probably what you'll have to see. So obviously we're not sitting on our laurels and just hopefully and twiddling our thumbs, hoping things get better. Other options, we've had conversations with other airlines. We continue talking, and we did have awarded at the very beginning of this year a small community air service development grant for service to Denver that would support United Airlines or their partner SkyWest Airlines to have United Express service there. Obviously, it's a challenge right now just because of the situation with United and some of their scope clause issues here between now and this summer, as well, frankly, as profitability. While we say that, and I was saying that, the one bright shining spot has been Denver or the Intermountain West, it doesn't mean they're making money on those routes. It just means they're not losing as much money on those routes. And so there's still a very significant financial risk for United or SkyWest to add service anytime here in the next 6, 7, 8 months until demand starts recovering there. And that would absolutely jeopardize, the long-term viability of our service if they came in and started service in the middle of this winter and all of our revenue guarantee money is spent and it's still not recovered. At that point, we would be jeopardizing the ability to keep that service long-term. One of the other options, we've had some conversations with various airlines. Cape Air is one of them that we've talked to. That's a partner that operates 9-seat prop aircraft in EAS markets typically. But there are some challenges there. Partly, frankly, the profitability of a 9-seat airplane is a challenge in a non-subsidized environment. There are very few, if any, unsubsidized 9-seat markets in the United States that doesn't involve flying to an island or a peninsula. So there are ones that show up in Florida flying to islands, obviously up and down the East Coast, especially with, Cape Cod and Nantucket have some of those. But outside of those, it's really, really challenged to make money on a 9-seat airplane because you only have 9 seats to spread a relatively high cost across. And so those fares end up being higher, which then dissuades people from flying, which then means the fares got to be higher because you have less people, and it gets in this vicious cycle. And so it really becomes a bit of a challenge there. Also, that impact potentially to American, because at the end of the day, American continues to reiterate every time I talk to them, they want to be in Dubuque long term. They see themselves in Dubuque long term. The challenge is the surviving of American Airlines today and this unprecedented time there. Other alternatives, things like scheduled charters or stuff like that is the same challenge as you have with some of the smaller Part 135 carriers in that the connectivity is a challenge. You don't have interline or code share relationships in those charters. So, people that wanted to fly to Chicago, we don't have almost much traffic going to Chicago and stopping there. People fly from Dubuque to Chicago to then connect beyond. And so there is a challenge if you don't have those interline or connecting code share relationships to be able to get people to fly from Dubuque to Chicago to connect beyond that. So while those are options and we continue looking at them, at this point, my personal opinion is doing whatever we can to get American Airlines service back in as quickly as we can is probably the most important thing for Dubuque to be doing as we continue having conversations with United, with SkyWest about eventually, as we round the corner and the airline industry starts showing signs of life on the business market, to bring Denver service into the community and grow that way. So with that, I think we'll open it up for any questions. Todd, I don't know if you want to ask them or do you want me to read them off the chat or how we want to do this?
No, I think Ryan's going to read them off, but actually you just answered some of our top 2-3 questions there with, why don't we just replace American with United or Delta or Southwest? So I think you just painted the whole picture, and thank you for doing that. And thank you for touching on the what we call alternate air service, the Cape Air. So, although it may look good, as you just mentioned in their conversation, their ticket prices are going to be quite a bit more. So if somebody looks at an airfare out of Dubuque on American Airlines, which you can book on American Airlines on this Cape Air 10-seat plane, your airfare is going to be considerably higher than what it's going to be out of a Cedar Rapids, and it's really not going to bode well on Dubuque as well. So those were a couple of things. The other question that I actually been getting recently is, now that everybody's used to doing online, just like we're doing today, right? Normally you would have flown to Dubuque on American and given this presentation down at the Julian, but today we're doing it virtually, and a lot of people are getting used to this business-wise. How's that going to affect Dubuque's business market? And I guess my response, and then we've had some conversations, is I remind people that Dubuque only captures about 20% of their market right now. So there's quite a bit of market out there to capture. And I guess I feel, and the people that I talk to, they would rather travel out of a Dubuque size airport just because of the touch-free, they don't have to deal with all the getting on a tram and standing in long compacted TSA lines at your Chicago O'Hares and even medium hubs for that matter. So and then you had a good point last time we talked that you feel that you're going to see your business that can do work from home move out of the Chicagos and things like that, and there's a potential for Dubuque to maybe pick up some of that traffic. They still may travel commercially, which I found that interesting. We just talked about, I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit more, but we just talked about that just a couple of days ago, and I thought that was something interesting.
Yeah, and there's definitely dueling opinions right now on business traffic. I'm of the opinion that it will bounce back. It will take some time. Part of the challenge, and I apologize if we have any CFOs on the line on this one. The biggest challenge with business traffic will be convincing the finance departments at every company that this great giant decrease in discretionary travel expenses is a bad thing long term. Because they'll look at it from a bottom line and say, God, we saved $3 million on travel, but it doesn't. At the end of the day, you can't close deals like this. This is not. While this is okay in the middle of a pandemic to do, I can't see this being the way that people are going to close, $3 million, $10 million, $100 million deals in the future by, sitting here staring at a little dot on the bubble. So I do not believe that will be a permanent change. It will take time to get people to want to travel again and do that, but I think that will happen. On the other piece of it, yes, one of the things that we're really seeing, especially in big cities, we're seeing this right now predominantly in San Francisco, LA, and New York, but we're hearing that it's starting to happen more in some of the other big cities, is as companies have gotten virtually permanent work from home situations, they're telling their employees, you're free to go. We're going to be closed at least until the end of next year. You can move. You don't have to be in San Francisco. You don't have to be in Chicago or New York. And what we're seeing is people leaving those and moving to, frankly, smaller markets for a better cost of living, better quality of life. And that's something that we see potentially adding business traffic to markets like Dubuque. Delta Airlines on their call last month, their earnings call, specifically called that out, that they are expecting over the next 5 years to see a shift potentially out of these big cities. The less, reliance upon New York and more reliance upon some of those secondary markets where people are able to work from home, and in some respects actually travel more because they're going to have to go see their team members. They're going to have to still go see their vendors. They're still going to have to go do, community meetings. I've worked from home for 10 years, and we still do all that. I still do all my other travel, but frankly, I probably travel more because I work from home, because we get together 2-3 times a year as a group. We get together as 1 or 2 times as a company as a whole. So that really has actually given me more traffic working from home than if I worked in an office.
Yeah, and in Dubuque, I just saw there's a bit of a travel ban in Washington, D.C., but obviously our meeting with our legislators and building those relationships, it's not the same over a video that you make, when you're face to face with them. Ryan, I don't want to take up all. Looks like we got about 10 minutes, and I know you're patiently waiting. Can you read off a couple questions for us, please?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Make sure everyone, by the way, if you're not talking, to mute yourself so there's not echo or anything. I'm going to ask 2 questions here from Marion Weber. And you've covered this a little bit earlier, but maybe we can have a little more detail about the process and everything. So she's asking, I have a local friend who flies for SkyWest. The company has very low debt, not furloughed any pilots. In fact, they're providing pilots on demand to many other carriers. Seems to me that SkyWest would be a strong target for partnership with Dubuque. How much is this affected by the United situation? And then she also asks, given the strong performance of Denver, should we try to get something going on for summer months, as leisure travelers are likely to continue to look for opportunities to access destinations that allow lots of outside and socially distanced vacation opportunities? And so Jeff, I know you talked a little bit about SkyWest in Denver. Maybe you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. No, I'm a big fan of SkyWest. I actually love the airline. I love the folks that work there. And we absolutely are having conversations. We've been talking to them quite a bit here over the last couple of months. We continue having plans for conversations here in the near future. And yes, their challenge is they operate for the airlines. And so American, United, and Delta contract for them predominantly for them to fly. Think of SkyWest kind of as a bus company. So when they're told when to show up, and they'll provide the aircraft and the crews and the maintenance, but United or Delta or American tell them exactly when to fly, where to fly, what type of airplane to fly, all of that. They do have a smaller subset that they make their own decisions, essentially what's called prorate, where they take the risk on for it. And that is one of the conversations we're having with them. They are limited, though, by what the other airlines will do, especially with United. That does limit them over the next, 6-7 months on what they want to do. I know talking to them, there's a laundry list of markets they see that they want to do, but they're not able to do them all, in large part because of some of those limitations on the number of aircraft that they're able to fly, and frankly, because of the current environment. We do see, and we do hopefully, again, plan on talking at length with SkyWest and hopefully United regarding service for next, summer, hopefully. But again, it is one of those challenges that we're not the only ones having that conversation with them. We're not the only ones that have money on the table to help support them. There is, again, another 50 or 100 markets out there that are having those exact same conversations that we are. And so, but yes, it is something that we plan on doing and continuing to do.
And the good news is, and Molly said this before, the good news is we do have money, so that's good. And there are markets out there that are using their SCASD money right now, i.e. Sioux City, that we all know, well, we don't all know, but from the industry, they're going to be blowing through that pretty fast. So the people that have money and are using it now are going to be using it, and they're going to be expired. And hopefully that puts us in a good position. So when the market does turn around, we'll be one of those key markets that has money to put down and at least start service. And hopefully that service carries us into, when the markets are even better. If I can just add to that real quick.
Great. Thanks for the answer on that. So right now we don't have any additional questions. Anyone who's on the webinar, please feel free to submit questions in either the chat box or the question area. Since we don't have questions, I'll ask one real quick. What are some action steps that people attending this meeting right now, what are some things that they can do to help our current situation? Is it, emailing our local, our federal delegation? What can they do to help?
Yeah, I think number one most important thing is pushing the federal delegation to support the payroll support program. Because at the end of the day, as much as personally it may not support the bailout of airlines, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, this is something that is unprecedented on the impact in the airline industry, and we are, again, essentially the unintended victim of that. So that would 100% help the current situation. And frankly, the more healthy the airlines are through the next 6 or 8, 10 months, the more likely that we're able to add Denver service in the future, be able to grow with America in the future. If the airlines don't have that extra help through this winter, which is going to be a very, very dark winter for the airline industry, that's just going to push everything else that much further out in the future. The other one is, frankly, locally, is there any funds available? Is there any, economic development funds, any, tax fund ability that would be out there to help support service, barring that payroll support program being extended? That could help, essentially kick off or kickstart or introduce that American service back into Dubuque quicker than just waiting for the natural, improvement of the industry or the payroll support program to happen. But that at the end of the day is pretty much all that can be done. I mean, there's not much else anyone else can do as far as having a magic bullet. I mean, at the end of the day, it's time or money that would help the situation.
And I think the other thing, Jeff, and you've said this before, and this is really hard for Dubuquers not to do, is don't panic, number one, and be patient on this one. And it's for Dubuquers and all the folks in our tri-state area that work so hard for this, and they do a great job and they support it. Just know that the airport, the chamber, all of our travel partners, yourself, Jeff, with Mead and Hunt, we're on this. We're continuing the conversations. We're here. We're not giving up by any shape or form, but we just have to be a little bit patient because this is a whole global experience. And but we're definitely poised, and we will continue to fight this until we get air service back. But that's the hardest thing right now is don't panic, and we just need a little patience.
Jeff, thank you so much for doing this presentation for us today. Before we close today, if we can just circle back and emphasize, I'm getting a lot of requests and conversation from my board on that charter issue. Well, why can't we just go out and partner with a charter service? Okay, forget American. Let's go out and make sure that our business community has charter service. You touched on it. And to put the facts out there, but as an expert, as someone that knows our market very well, circle back on that, why that might not be in our best interest, not just from a cost perspective, but I mean, would that be your recommendation?
Well, I mean, if the community has the funds for a charter operation to support, because at the end of the day, any service that operates today is going to lose money. There's no sugarcoating it. I mean, I'm not going to pretend to say that we add something and it's going to make money tomorrow. It's not. There's varying levels of losing money right now. So, again, if you're a ski market or you're a Florida beach destination, you're losing less money. If you're a business market, you're losing a lot of money. But if there's the funds available for that, then we should just go talk to American about essentially buying that service to have them fly to Chicago then. Because at the end of the day, you'll still keep the connectivity with American. You'll still have all the benefits of flying with American. Because if you do a charter service, you're going to lose money. You're going to be paying that out anyway. Because at the end of the day, we don't have people going to Chicago outside of Connecting Beyond, and very few people are going to want to pay a couple $100 a person to go to Chicago and then buy another ticket from Chicago beyond that. You also have the challenges of not having airline and code share relationships for those connections. You're buying two separate tickets. So if there's a weather delay, or a maintenance delay of that charter flight and it doesn't go, you're on the hook for your flight from American. You're paying the difference in fare for that change because there is no relationship between those two airlines to protect you if that flight is delayed or canceled. And that is why, frankly, charters don't work in that regard 95% of the time. They work if you're trying to go to a singular destination. So if we find Dubuque wants to go down to Sarasota, Florida, and there's 100 people at a time that want to do that, that's the type of thing for a charter. It's very rare to make a charter situation work for a business environment unless it's a singular company paying to go to a singular destination for their employees.
Yeah, and I think to add to that too, the ones that do offer code share, so the ones that have that you can go on the American Airline website, United website, you can book from Dubuque to wherever, and you show up at the airport and you're going to get on a 10-seat airplane to Chicago, which is fine. It's all part of their system. But a couple things. One, you're going to be paying a lot higher price than what you're going to be paying out of like a Cedar Rapids or somewhere else. So then we're going to get the questions, well, why aren't our airfares competitive? Well, they are, but they have to cover the expense of this smaller charter aircraft, which is the big one. But then I think even the biggest is if they're already code sharing on American and United, and we're flying American United passengers out of here and possibly even paying for it, on a Cape Air, for example, American would say, well, why should we provide service to Dubuque? They're already transporting our passengers. You know, we've got a base there right now, which they do today. There's a base here at Dubuque. All their equipment is there, the computers, everything. They're ready to restart at any time. And that's, of course, an expense for them. So they could actually say, you know what? Cape Air is already taking care of our passengers. Why don't we just pull out of Dubuque? And if we lose them, it's much harder to get them back, as Jeff mentioned, than just getting pushed, you know, postponed out in 4-week increments. If they pull out all together, it's going to be much more difficult to regain an American, you know, of course, United or whoever were not here. So I guess I'd just like to add that on to Jeff's comments.
Yeah, and I think the clarification real quick on, you know, just making sure to clarify the difference between the charter and Cape Air. Cape Air is a scheduled service. And so they've talked about wanting to potentially, you know, fly without subsidies and stuff. That's the risk that Todd's actually talking about. A charter is essentially a very different economic animal in the airline industry. A true charter means whoever's organizing it has the full financial risk of it. And so they will be responsible for paying cash to that operator that is operating that. If we're, and then using the offset in revenue to, you know, bring that back in and hopefully not owe anything on it. If that's a situation we're in and there's enough demand to do a charter service to Chicago, then I would assume there's enough demand to support American Airlines service to Chicago and doing a similar situation.
I think that's a good point. I think people probably interchange service with a smaller airline and charter. They think those are interchangeable, and they're not. So I think that point is important. One last thing before we wrap up. We are business organizations, and we have members and investors that we support, and our job is to solve problems. And so one of the issues is we have business community that does still need to fly. And one of the suggestions has been, why don't we come up with a service that will transport our people that need to fly, our businesses, to other airports. And if you can just real quickly touch on that, the advantages and obvious disadvantages of doing something like that.
Yeah, and this is a catch-22. You definitely, being able to make it more convenient for folks to be able to fly for Dubuque business is obviously important, because at the end of the day, there are still people that need to travel. Again, when we say there's no business traffic left, 95%, 98%, there's still people that absolutely have to travel. People that need to go travel to see their family or friends because of an emergency or whatever, or frankly, they just want to go on vacation. So obviously there's some demand, there's some need to travel out of Dubuque and out of everywhere. The risk that I've seen, and I've seen this elsewhere, when you have a van service or a bus service to an alternate airport, is it's a challenge to get rid of it at that point once it gets established. And you don't want to make it more convenient for people to go to Cedar Rapids or Moline or Madison than it already is. At the end of the day, our biggest problem is the fact that it is a 4-lane road. You get to Cedar Rapids most of the way, and it's a hour and a half, hour and 45-minute drive down the road. That is our number one problem to retain traffic here in Dubuque. What we don't want to have to do is make it more convenient to drive 5 minutes, park at a parking lot, and then they can sit there in their car in a shuttle and do work on their drive to Cedar Rapids and start to travel. That would be a very big challenge for Dubuque to overcome in the future, because people would then say, well, I've got that much more opportunity to fly out of Cedar Rapids. They have service to Atlanta and Dallas, Denver, more service to Chicago, to Detroit, Minneapolis. All of that means less desire to fly from Dubuque. The whole point of air service from Dubuque is it's more convenient. It's easier to drive 5 minutes, get in the airport, get in the airplane, and go. We don't want to make it more convenient to go to Cedar Rapids. I think that would be a very, very long, hard thing to overcome in the future.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So that concludes our forum today, our special report on air service and COVID impacts. On behalf of the Dubuque Area Chamber of Commerce and the Dubuque Regional Airport, I want to thank our colleagues, our partners, our friends that have joined us here today. This is recorded, so we will be able to share this if you're interested in viewing this again. As you can see, I think we're the definition of being between a rock and a hard place, and the kind of not having, we have couple options and we don't like any of the options. So thank you very much, Jeffrey, for the time that you spent on this and sharing your expertise. We appreciate it. Everyone, be safe. Remember to wear a mask, stay healthy, and thank you for your support. Have a great day.
Thank you all.